Welcome back, Cyclings. We're going to start today with Unit 1, Section 2. We'll look at the different approaches and the different subfields of psychology. So this is the second installment. So we're going to start with Charles Darwin. Okay, so Charles Darwin was actually a biologist. He was studying evolution, and in 1831 he went to the Galapagos Islands and was looking at the different species and came up with this idea of what's called natural selection. Okay, so this theory of natural selection is basically that traits are passed on from one species to the next in order to help with survival. And so he related this to behavior by making it to where we have this ability to have traits that we have that kind of make it to where we evolve over time. So things that help us with survival are things that we are going to continue. And he kind of started the nature versus nurture debate. Okay, so nurture is this idea that we are raised a certain way and that influences our behaviors, and nature is that we were born that way. So this is a approach that has still been going through psychology today, and it's still something that is very well and hotly debated. And so we look at the influences of both when we study. So the debate originally was nature versus nurture. So those two things couldn't happen together. And now psychology looks at it kind of as nature via nurture. So how those two things interact. So not only do we have then the nature versus nurture debate, we also have different approaches to psychology. And so most of the time we look at what's called a biopsychosocial approach, which is looking at both biology, psychology, and social factors. Okay, so the biopsychosocial is looking at all three of those things together. Individually, the biological approach is essentially looking at our brain chemistry, our neurobiology, and how those different aspects influence our behaviors. We also then have evolutionary approach, and that is basically looking at how our traits have kind of survived over time, and how those traits and how the nature that we have, how that influences and impacts our behavior and mental processes. We also have the psychodynamic approach, which looks at past conflicts, especially childhood traumas and sexual experiences. Then we have the behavioral approach, which looks at strictly behavior and nothing to do with the mental processes or the thought behind them, but only looking at things that we can observe. We also then have the cognitive approach, which looks at the exact opposite of behavioral. So while behavioral looks at just behaviors, cognitive looks at thinking and mental processes and discounts behaviors altogether. We then have the humanistic approach that looks at human needs and those needs fulfillment. So in order for us to be as good as we can be as human beings, we have to look at, are our needs for love and things like that being met. And then finally, we have the social cultural approach, which looks at how other people around us influence our behaviors, influence our thoughts, and overall influence our psychology. So those are the different approaches. And so now we're going to look at some of the subfields and how those approaches apply. So when we look at approaches, these are essentially how the different psychologists kind of look at psychology in general. So these are how we look at it. The subfields are how we study it and the kind of the jobs that go with it. Okay, so from the biological subfield, we look at brain biology, okay, and those that how just looking at biology, how that influences our psychology. Developmental looks at the different ways that people develop through childhood, through old age, and how those different developmental processes influence the way they think and the way they behave. Then we have the cognitive, which remember, every time you hear cognitive, think of thinking. Okay, so cognitive behavioral, or subfield, basically looks at just our thought patterns, and that's the only thing that they study. Educational psychologists look at how students learn and the most appropriate, developmentally appropriate ideas for education. And so they work in school settings to make sure that learning is appropriate for all age levels. Personality psychologists, or that subfield, looks at personality traits, personality behaviors, different theories of personality, and how those influence people's behaviors. Then we have social, and social psychologists look at how people interact in environments. We see a lot of social psychologists in places like workforces, looking at how people interact and how that can change their abilities to do their jobs. And then finally, we have the two most popular or most important subfields in clinical and counseling psychologists. Okay, counseling psychologists deal strictly with adjustment problems, and you will see those people in colleges and other kind of workforces looking at how people are struggling with different adjustments and how that influences their behaviors and their well-being. And then clinical psychologists are kind of who we think about when we think of psychologists in general. And they're the ones that usually provide direct treatment to individuals. So if you have a mental disorder or mental illness, you'll probably go see a clinical psychologist first to talk about those different issues that you're having and kind of look at the reasons behind them. And then from there, they can prescribe you to another doctor if they think you need medication or if you need further treatment. So that is contemporary psychology in a nutshell. So that's kind of how we got to where we are now with the different approaches and the different subfields.